In the windswept plains of 1880s Wyoming, a wealthy cattle baron named Silas McGraw lived alone on his vast ranch, haunted by the memory of his wife who perished in a terrible fire. His heart had grown as cold as the winter storms that swept across his land. One fateful summer day, he heard tell of Clara Bell, a blind piano teacher, abandoned by her own family in the dusty frontier town. Something stirred in his weathered soul when he learned of her fierce independence and refusal to accept pity from anyone. On an impulse he couldn't quite explain, Silas invited this remarkable woman to his ranch, thinking a horseback ride might give her a taste of the freedom she craved. What he didn't expect was how Clara would change everything about his solitary existence, teaching him to see the world through her extraordinary gift of perception. But how could two wounded souls, both carrying the scars of profound loss, find their way to a love that would last until their final breath? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the McGraw ranch as Silas stood on his front porch, coffee cup in hand, surveying the endless expanse of grassland that stretched to the horizon. 3 years had passed since the fire, yet he still found himself listening for Sarah's gentle humming from the kitchen, still expecting to see her tending the small garden she'd planted behind the house. The silence that greeted him each dawn felt heavier than the Wyoming wind. At 42, Silas McGraw had built an empire from nothing. His cattle grazed on 30,000 acres of prime rangeland. His name commanded respect in every saloon and bank from Cheyenne to Casper, and his wealth could buy him anything he desired. Yet the simple gold band on his finger worn smooth by years of absent-minded turning remained his most treasured possession, a reminder of what money could never replace. The ranch house itself bore witness to his success and his sorrow. Built of fine timber hauled from the Colorado mountains, it stood 2 stories tall with a wraparound porch that Sarah had insisted upon. "A house should welcome folks," she'd said, her eyes bright with dreams of dinner parties and Sunday gatherings. Now the house felt more like a monument to loneliness, its rooms echoing with memories instead of laughter. Silas pulled his pocket watch from his vest, another habit that died hard. 7:30, which meant his foreman, Red Murphy, would be riding up any minute with the day's report. Red had been with him since the beginning, a grizzled Irishman who'd seen more of the world than most men twice his age. He was also the only soul brave enough to speak honestly to Silas about matters that went beyond cattle and weather. "Morning, boss," Red called out as he approached, his horse's hooves crunching on the packed earth. "Got word from town yesterday evening. Doc Peterson's been asking after you." Silas raised an eyebrow. "I'm fit as a fiddle, Red. What's the doc want with me?" "Ain't about your health, boss. It's about that piano teacher, the blind gal. Clara Bell, I think her name is." The name was familiar, whispered in the hushed tones that accompanied all tragic tales in small frontier towns. Silas had heard fragments of her story over the past months, a young woman of 26 who'd lost her sight to fever as a child, who'd made her way west to teach music to the children of hopeful settlers. Her family, ashamed of her condition, had disowned her when she refused to marry a man twice her age, who'd offered to take her off their hands. "What about her?" Silas asked, though something in his chest tightened with unexpected interest. "Well, seems her situation's gotten desperate. The family she was staying with up and moved to California, left her behind with nothing but a piano and a room above the general store. Mrs. Henderson's been feeding her out of Christian charity, but you know how folks get when times are hard." Silas knew all too well. Charity had its limits, especially when winter was coming and everyone had their own troubles to worry about. "What's the doc expect me to do about it?" Red shifted in his saddle, his weathered face creasing with something that might have been a smile. "He didn't say exactly, but I got the impression he thinks you might have some ideas. Says she's got more pride than sense, won't take handouts. Teaches piano to any child whose parents can spare a few coins, but it ain't near enough to keep body and soul together." The image formed unbidden in Silas's mind. a woman alone in a strange place, facing an uncertain future with nothing but her dignity and determination. It stirred something in him that had been dormant for 3 years, a protective instinct that had once made him want to shield Sarah from every hardship the world might offer. "She's got spirit, that one," Red continued. "Heard tell she walked herself down to the church social last Sunday, white cane and all, and played piano for the singing. Not a dry eye in the house when she finished. Amazing grace. Even tough old Martha Peterson was wiping her face with her handkerchief." Silas found himself curious despite his better judgment. "What's she like?" "Pretty as a spring morning, from what I hear. Golden hair, green eyes, and a voice that could charm birds from the trees, but it's her spirit that folks remember most. Doc says she's got the heart of a wildcat, won't let nobody treat her like she's helpless just because she can't see." The description painted a vivid picture, one that tugged at something deep in Silas's chest. He'd always admired strength in the face of adversity, perhaps because life had demanded so much of it from him. Sarah had possessed that same quiet courage, facing each day with grace, despite the hardships of frontier life. "Boss," Red's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You got that look again." "What look?" "The one you get when you're chewing on something important. Same look you had when you decided to buy the Morrison place, or when you figured out how to get water to the south pasture." Silas turned away from his foreman's knowing gaze. Red had an uncomfortable ability to read his thoughts, a skill honed by years of working together. "Just thinking about what the doc said, that's all." "Might be worth a ride into town," Red suggested casually. "Been a while since you showed your face at Henderson's store anyway. Folks might think you're getting antisocial." The suggestion wasn't entirely unwelcome. Silas had been avoiding town more and more lately, finding excuses to send Red or one of the other hands on errands that once would have taken him away from the ranch. The sympathetic looks and careful conversations had grown tiresome, as had the well-meaning attempts by various townspeople to introduce him to suitable women. But this felt different somehow. The story of Clara Bell's circumstances had awakened something in him, not romance, exactly, but a sense of purpose that had been missing from his days. Here was a problem that money could solve, a person who needed help but wouldn't ask for it. The combination appealed to his practical nature and his dormant sense of chivalry. "I'll ride in this afternoon," he decided. "Need to check on the lumber order for the new barn anyway." Red's grin was barely concealed. "Sure thing, boss. I'll have Jake saddle Thunder for you." As his foreman rode away, Silas remained on the porch, his mind already working through possibilities. The ranch had several guest bedrooms that hadn't been used since Sarah's passing, and the old piano in the front parlor had been silent for just as long. Perhaps there was a way to help this Clara Bell that wouldn't wound her pridea proposition, that would benefit them both. The more he considered it, the more the idea took shape. The isolation that had become his refuge might serve a different purpose now. Away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of town, a proud woman could accept assistance without feeling diminished by it. And perhaps, in some small way, bringing life back to the empty rooms of his house might ease the weight of solitude that had settled so heavily on his shoulders. By the time the afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains, Silas was riding toward town on Thunder, his mind made up. He would meet this Clara Bell, assess her situation for himself, and if she proved to be the remarkable woman Red had described, he would make her an offer that pride could accept, a place to stay, a piano to play, and the dignity of earning her keep in whatever way she saw fit. The wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers as he urged Thunder into a steady lope. For the first time in 3 years, Silas McGraw felt something stirring in his chest that wasn't grief or regret. It was anticipation, fragile as a new colt, but undeniably real. Change was coming to the McGraw ranch, and perhaps that wasn't such a terrible thing after all. The general store smelled of tobacco, leather, and the faint sweetness of penny candy. Silas pushed through the door, the bell overhead announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed out of place with his somber mood. He'd spent the entire ride to town rehearsing what he might say, but now that he was here, the words felt clumsy on his tongue. Well, I'll be. Martha Henderson called from behind the counter, her round face brightening with surprise. Silas McGraw, as I live and breathe. Haven't seen you in town for nigh on 2 months. Martha. He touched the brim of his hat politely. How are you keeping? Oh, can't complain. Business is steady, and the Lord provides. She studied him with the sharp eyes of a woman who'd raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. What brings you to town today? Need supplies for the ranch? Actually, I was hoping to speak with Doc Peterson. Red mentioned he had something to discuss with me. Martha's expression grew knowing. About young Clara, I'd wager. Poor thing's been weighing heavy on his mind lately. She gestured toward the stairs leading to the 2nd floor. She's up there now, giving little Tommy Morrison his piano lesson. Sweet child, that Clara, too proud for her own good, but sweet as honey. As if summoned by her words, the sound of piano music drifted down from above a gentle melody that seemed to transform the cramped store into something approaching elegant. The playing was masterful, each note clear and purposeful, but it was the emotion behind the music that caught Silas's attention. There was longing in those notes, and hope, and a kind of determined joy that spoke of a spirit refusing to be broken. She's been teaching the children for 3 months now, Martha continued, lowering her voice. Charges what folks can afford, which ain't much. I let her stay in the room upstairs for free, but I can't do much more than that. My husband's already grumbling about the charity cases. The music stopped, and a woman's voice could be heard offering gentle encouragement to her young student. Try it again, Tommy. Remember, the music lives in your heart first, then travels to your fingers. Silas found himself drawn toward the stairs, Martha's chatter fading into background noise. There was something about that voice, warm, patient, with just a hint of the South in its cadence that made him want to hear more of it. Tommy's been coming twice a week, Martha was saying. His mother pays with eggs and milk, bless her heart. Clara never complains, just takes what folks can give and makes do. Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced the lesson's end. A boy of perhaps 8 came clattering down, his face flushed with concentration and pride. Behind him, moving with careful grace, came the woman Silas had ridden into town to meet. Clara Bell was indeed as beautiful as Red had described, but it was her bearing that struck Silas most forcefully. She descended the stairs with her left hand trailing along the banister, her right holding a carved wooden cane that moved in practiced sweeps before her feet. There was no hesitation in her movements, no request for help or sympathy. She moved through the world as if she owned it, despite the obvious care she took with each step. Her hair was the color of prairie wheat, braided simply and pinned at the nape of her neck. Her dress was plain but clean, mended in places with tiny, precise stitches. Her eyes, when she turned them toward the sound of voices, were indeed green, the deep green of pine forest sand, though they didn't focus on any particular point. They seemed to take in everything around her. Tommy, she was saying to the boy, practice those scales every day this week. Your mother will be so proud when you can play Mary Had a Little Lamb for her. The boy beamed and scampered toward the door, clutching a penny candy that Martha had pressed into his hand. Clara remained at the bottom of the stairs, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Clara, dear, Martha called, we have company. This is Silas McGraw, the rancher I was telling you about. Clara turned toward the sound of Silas's breathing, and for a moment he felt as if those unseeing eyes could somehow peer straight into his soul. She extended her hand with the same confidence she'd shown on the stairs. Mr. McGraw, she said, and her voice was even more musical in conversation than it had been when teaching. I've heard your name mentioned with great respect. It's a pleasure to meet you. Her handshake was firm, her palms slightly calloused from years of piano playing. Miss Bell, he replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. The pleasure is mine. I'll leave you two to get acquainted, Martha said with the sort of pleased smile that suggested she was already planning how to spread this news around town. I need to check on the storeroom anyway. An awkward silence settled between them after Martha's departure. Clara's head was still tilted in that listening posture, and Silas found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence in her expression and the way her mouth curved slightly upward, as if she were perpetually on the verge of smiling. "You've come about my circumstances," she said finally, her voice matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "Doc Peterson's been spreading the word, hasn't he? Good man, but he worries too much about things that aren't his concern." "He's concerned about your welfare," Silas replied carefully, "as are others in town. And you've come to offer charity." It wasn't a question, and there was a slight edge to her tone now. "I appreciate the kindness, Mr. McGraw, but I'm managing quite well on my own." "Are you?" The question came out more sharply than he'd intended. "Forgive me, but Martha tells me you're living on eggs and milk, and winter's coming fast." Clara's chin lifted a gesture of defiance that reminded him oddly of Sarah when she'd set her mind on something. "I'm not starving, if that's what you're asking. And I have my teaching. More families are beginning to trust me with their children." "That's not what I'm offering," Silas said quickly, sensing that he was losing whatever small advantage he might have had. "I'm not here to insult your pride, Miss Bell. I'm here because I have a proposition that might benefit us both." Her expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing defensiveness. "What sort of proposition?" Silas took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either open a door or close it permanently. "I have a large ranch about an hour's ride from town. The house has rooms that haven't been used in years, and a piano that hasn't been played since my wife died. I also have several ranch hands with children who could benefit from music lessons, not to mention the families in the surrounding area who might appreciate having a teacher closer to home." Clara's cane shifted slightly, a small movement that Silas was beginning to recognize as a sign of her thinking. "You're offering me a place to stay in exchange for teaching." "I'm offering you independence," he corrected, "a place where you can build your teaching practice without worrying about rent or meals. A place where you can come and go as you please, accept the students you choose, and set your own terms." "And what would you get out of this arrangement?" The question was fair, and Silas found himself struggling to answer it honestly. What did he hope to gain? Company? A sense of purpose? The simple pleasure of knowing he'd helped someone who needed it? "A house that feels less empty," he said finally. "Music in rooms that have been too quiet for too long. The knowledge that my wife's piano is being put to good use instead of gathering dust." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her unseeing gaze fixed somewhere over his shoulder. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, though still cautious. "This is a generous offer, Mr. McGraw, almost too generous. What aren't you telling me?" Her perceptiveness caught him off guard. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean that in my experience, when something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. You're a wealthy man, offering a virtual stranger room and board in exchange for a few piano lessons. That's either the act of a saint or someone with ulterior motives." Silas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I assure you, Miss Bell, my intentions are entirely honorable." "I don't doubt your honor," she said quietly, "but I do question your motives. Why me? Why now? There are plenty of people in this town who could use help." The truth sat heavy in his chest, complicated and difficult to voice. How could he explain that her situation had awakened something in him that he'd thought dead? That her courage in the face of adversity reminded him of the man he'd been before grief had made him bitter and withdrawn. "Because," he said at last, "you remind me that there are still people in this world worth helping, people who face their troubles with dignity and grace instead of complaint and self-pity." Clara's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since their conversation began, she smiled, real smile that transformed her entire face. "That's either the most honest thing you've said since you walked in here, or the most flattering lie I've heard in months." "It's the truth," Silas said simply. She nodded slowly, as if coming to some internal decision. "I'll consider your offer, Mr. McGraw, but I'll need to see the place first, meet your ranch hands, and understand exactly what you're proposing before I make any commitments." "Of course. Would tomorrow be convenient? I could send someone to fetch you." "I'll ride with you," Clara said firmly. "I may be blind, but I'm not helpless, and if I'm going to live somewhere, I need to experience it for myself. Silas found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow it is, then. I'll bring a gentle horse, and be here by 9. As he turned to leave, Clara's voice stopped him. Mr. McGraw, thank you for offering me a choice instead of charity. It means more than you know. Walking back to where Thunder waited, Silas felt the stirring of something that had been dormant for 3 years. It wasn't love, he wasn't ready for that. Might never be ready, but it was hope, fragile and new, as a spring flower pushing through hard ground. Tomorrow, Clara Bell would come to his ranch, and perhaps both their lives would begin to change in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The morning air carried the promise of autumn when Silas arrived at Henderson's store with a gentle mare named Daisy and Thunder's familiar presence beside him. Clara emerged from the store, wearing a simple riding skirt and boots, her cane tapping confidently against the wooden planks of the sidewalk. Martha Henderson hovered nearby, wringing her hands with the sort of worry that suggested she'd been up all night, fretting about this arrangement. Now, Clara, dear, Martha was saying, you be careful out there, and Mr. McGraw, you bring her back safe, you hear? I'll be fine, Martha, Clara replied with patient affection. I've been riding since I was a child. Silas watched as Clara approached the horses, her free hand extended palm up. Daisy nickered softly and stepped forward, pressing her velvet nose into Clara's outstretched palm. The connection was immediate and profound. Clara's face lit up with genuine joy as she ran her hands along the mare's neck and shoulder. She's beautiful, Clara murmured, her voice filled with wonder. Strong but gentle. Good bone structure, and she's well cared for. Her hands continued their exploration, reading the horse's conformation with the same skill she brought to piano keys. She's curious about me too, I can feel it in the way she's standing. How can you tell all that? Silas asked, genuinely amazed. Clara's smile was radiant. Horses speak with their bodies, Mr. McGraw. They tell you everything you need to know if you're willing to listen. Daisy here is telling me she's trustworthy, that she'll take care of me. Aren't you, girl? The mare waffled softly against Clara's shoulder, as if in agreement. Within minutes, Clara had adjusted the stirrups by feel, accepted a boost into the saddle, and was sitting astride Daisy with the natural grace of someone born to ride. You weren't exaggerating about your riding experience, Silas observed, swinging up onto Thunder. My father bred horses before. Clara's voice caught slightly, then continued with determined cheerfulness. Before my circumstances changed, I learned to ride the same way I learned to play piano, feeling and listening rather than watching. As they made their way out of town, Silas found himself stealing glances at his companion. Clara rode with unconscious elegance, her body moving in perfect harmony with Daisy's gait. Her face was turned toward the sun, and she seemed to be absorbing every sound, every scent, every sensation the prairie offered. Tell me about your ranch, she said as they settled into a comfortable pace. I want to know what I'm riding into. Silas began to describe the rolling grasslands, the scattered herds of cattle, the distant mountains that framed the horizon. But Clara interrupted him with a gentle laugh. I don't need to know what it looks like, Mr. McGraw. I need to know what it feels like. Is it a happy place? A peaceful place? Does it feel like home? The question caught him off guard. When had he stopped thinking of the ranch as home and started thinking of it as simply the place where he existed? It used to be, he said honestly. Before Sarah died, it was the happiest place on earth. Now it's just quiet. Quiet can be good, Clara said thoughtfully. But there's a difference between peaceful quiet and lonely quiet. Which is it? Lonely, Silas admitted, surprised by his own honesty. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through grass. Clara's head was tilted slightly, and Silas realized she was listening to something he couldn't hear. There's water nearby, she said suddenly. A stream, maybe a quarter-mile to the east, and cattle a large herd, probably 100 head or more. They're content, well-fed. She paused, concentrating. And there's something else. Music. Silas listened hard, but heard nothing beyond the usual prairie sounds. Music? Not music exactly, Clara corrected. But the land has a rhythm, a harmony. It's singing, Mr. McGraw. Your ranch is singing. The observation was so unexpected, so poetic, that Silas found himself looking at his familiar surroundings with new eyes. Was there music in the wind through the grass? Harmony in the lowing of cattle and the cry of hawks overhead? If so, it was a song he'd stopped hearing years ago. There, Clara said, pointing toward a stand of cottonwoods. That's where your house is, isn't it? I can smell wood smoke and cooking, and the trees are older there, more established. How do you do that? Silas asked, genuinely awed. When you can't see the world, you learn to read it differently, Clara explained. Every place has its own signature sounds, smells, the way the air moves. Your ranch has a good signature, Mr. McGraw. It wants to be happy again. As they crested the low hill that revealed the ranch house in full view, Silas heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. It's big, she said, and for the first time since meeting her, he heard uncertainty in her voice. Too big, he agreed. Sarah always said it was too big for just the two of us. She planned to fill it with children and grandchildren and noise and laughter. The words came out more bitter than he'd intended. Clara's expression grew thoughtful. Maybe she still will, in a way. Maybe that's why I'm here. The ranch hands were waiting in the yard, their curiosity barely contained. Red Murphy stepped forward as they dismounted, his weathered face creased with interest. Boys, Silas said, this is Miss Clara Bell. She's considering staying on as a music teacher for the children in the area. The introduction was met with a mixture of nods and murmured greetings. Clara stepped forward, her cane sweeping gently before her, and addressed the group with the same confidence she'd shown at the general store. I hope to meet all of you properly in time, she said. Mr. McGraw tells me some of you have children who might benefit from music lessons. I'd be happy to discuss that with anyone who's interested. My boy Jake's got a fine voice, offered Pete Larson, a lean cowboy with sun-weathered skin. Been singing since he could talk. Might could use some proper instruction. I'd be honored to work with him, Clara replied. Music is a gift that should be nurtured wherever it's found. As the group dispersed to their various duties, Red lingered behind. She's got sand, I'll give her that, he said quietly to Silas. But are you sure about this, boss? Having a woman around again, it might stir up memories that are best left buried. Silas watched Clara as she carefully explored the front porch, her hands trailing along the railing, her face turned toward the sound of wind chimes that Sarah had hung years ago. Maybe it's time for some memories to be stirred up, he said. The good ones, anyway. Inside the house, Clara's reaction was immediate and profound. She stopped just inside the front door, her head tilted in that listening posture, and Silas saw tears gather in her eyes. She loved this place, Clara said softly. Your wife. I can feel it in every corner, the way she arranged the furniture, the care she took with little details. She had a gift for making a house feel like a home. How can you possibly know that? Silas asked, his voice rough with emotion. The same way I know that piano in the corner is a Steinway, perfectly tuned and lovingly maintained. The same way I know there are fresh flowers in that vase on the mantel, even though it's been 3 years since she picked them. Love leaves an impression, Mr. McGraw. It soaks into the walls and the floors and the very air itself. Clara moved through the house with growing confidence, her cane tapping lightly against furniture and walls. She paused in the kitchen, running her fingers along the well-worn counter, then moved into the parlor, where Sarah's piano sat in its place of honor. May I? She asked, settling onto the bench without waiting for an answer. Her fingers found the keys as if by instinct, and she began to play not the simple melodies she'd been teaching Tommy Morrison, but something complex and heartbreakingly beautiful. The music filled the empty rooms, seeming to awaken echoes that had been sleeping for too long. When the last note faded, Clara sat quietly for a moment, her hands resting on the keys. She played this too, she said finally. I can feel her in the music, in the way the keys respond. She was good, not professionally trained, perhaps, but she had heart. Silas found his voice with difficulty. She played every evening after dinner, usually hymns, sometimes popular songs. She said music made the house feel complete. "It does," Clara agreed. "And it wants to be played again. Instruments grow sad when they're not used, Mr. McGraw. They lose their voice. Would you stay?" The question came out more abruptly than he'd intended. "I mean, would you consider accepting my offer? I know it's not what you're used to, being so far from town, but—" "Yes," Clara interrupted, her voice firm and sure. "I'll stay, on one condition." "Name it." "That you let me earn my keep properly. I'll teach the children, I'll play for church services and social gatherings, I'll even help with household tasks if you need it. But I won't be a charity case or a decoration for your lonely house. I'll be a partner in making this place feel like home again." Silas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot that had lived there for 3 years. "Partners, then," he agreed, extending his hand. Clara's handshake was firm and warm, her green eyes bright with determination and hope. "Partners," she agreed. "Though I should warn you, Mr. McGraw, I have a feeling this arrangement is going to change both our lives in ways we can't imagine." As the afternoon sun slanted through the parlor windows, casting golden light across the piano keys, Silas found himself believing that change might not be such a fearsome thing after all. The house felt different already, more alive, more purposeful, and for the first time in 3 years, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow. Within a week of Clara's arrival, the McGraw ranch had begun to transform in ways both subtle and profound. The most obvious change was the music that now flowed from the house at all hour scales and exercises in the morning, children's lessons in the afternoon, and in the evenings, melodies that seemed to pour straight from Clara's soul onto the ivory keys. Silas found himself inventing reasons to remain near the house during lesson hours, ostensibly checking on ranch business, but actually drawn by the sound of Clara's patient voice, guiding her young students. She had a gift for teaching that went beyond mere technical instruction. She somehow managed to unlock each child's natural musical instincts while building their confidence and joy in the process. "Remember Sarah?" Clara was saying to Pete Larson's 8-year-old daughter, "The music isn't in the notes on the page. The music is in your heart, and your fingers are just helping it find its way out." Little Sarah Larson, who had been struggling with a simple melody, suddenly broke into a smile as her fingers found the right rhythm. "I can feel it, Miss Clara. The music is really in there." "Of course it is," Clara replied, her own smile radiant. "It's been waiting for you to discover it." These moments of breakthrough became precious to Silas, reminders of the joy that music could bring to daily life. He found himself lingering in the hallway outside the parlor, listening to Clara's gentle corrections and enthusiastic praise, feeling something frozen in his chest gradually begin to thaw. The evenings were perhaps the most remarkable transformation. After the children had gone home and the ranch work was done, Clara would settle at the piano and play for the pure pleasure of it. Sometimes she would ask Silas to join her, and they would sit in the parlor while she filled the room with everything from classical pieces to folk songs to hymns that seemed to rise from the deepest wells of human longing. "Do you have any requests?" she asked one evening, her fingers dancing across the keys in a series of gentle arpeggios. Silas considered the question, then said quietly, "Sarah used to play Beautiful Dreamer. It was her favorite." Clara's hands stilled for a moment, and he wondered if he'd made a mistake in mentioning his deceased wife. But then she began to play, and the familiar melody filled the room with such tenderness that Silas felt tears prick his eyes. "She had good taste," Clara said softly as the last notes faded. "It's a song about hope and love transcending time. Beautiful choice for a woman who clearly understood both." "She did," Silas agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "She understood a lot of things I'm only beginning to learn." Clara turned toward him on the piano bench, her unseeing eyes somehow finding his face. "What kinds of things?" "That loneliness isn't the same as solitude. that grief doesn't have to mean the end of joy, that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to keep on living. Those are hard lessons, Clara said gently. I'm still learning some of them myself. It was the first time she'd alluded to her own losses, and Silas found himself curious about the pain that had shaped her resilience. What happened with your family? He asked carefully, if you don't mind my asking. Clara's hands returned to the keys, playing a soft, melancholy melody as she spoke. My father bred horses, as I mentioned. We had a good life, a comfortable life, until the fever took my sight when I was 12. Suddenly, I went from being his promising daughter to being his burden. When I refused to marry the man he'd chosen for me, a widower who wanted a quiet, grateful wife to care for his children, my father gave me an ultimatum. Accept the marriage or leave his house forever. So you left, Silas said, and it wasn't a question. I left, Clara confirmed. I'd rather face the world alone than live as someone's reluctant obligation. My music was the only thing that was truly mine, so I made it my livelihood. It's been a hard road sometimes, but it's been my road. I'm sorry, Silas said, meaning it. No parent should abandon their child for any reason. Oh, but they did me a favor, Clara replied, her voice growing stronger. They taught me that I could survive on my own, that I didn't need anyone's pity or protection to make my way in the world. That's a valuable lesson, even if it came at a high price. Her resilience amazed him. Where he had responded to loss by withdrawing from the world, Clara had responded by engaging with it more fully. She'd turned her limitations into strengths, her hardships into wisdom. You're remarkable, he said, and meant it. Clara's cheeks flushed pink. I'm just stubborn. Ask anyone who knows me. Stubborn people don't usually bring joy to everyone they meet, Silas pointed out. The ranch hands' children talk about you constantly. You've become the highlight of their week. Music has that effect, Clara said modestly. It brings people together, creates connections that go deeper than words. That's why I love teaching. Every child I work with becomes part of a larger harmony. As the days passed, Silas found himself drawn into that harmony despite his initial resistance. Clara's presence in the house had awakened something he'd thought permanently buried, capacity for companionship, for shared experiences, for the simple pleasure of another person's company. Their daily routines began to interweave in comfortable ways. Clara would rise early and play softly while Silas had his coffee on the porch, the gentle melodies blending with the sounds of awakening ranch life. She would join him for breakfast, their conversation ranging from practical matters about the day ahead to deeper discussions about books, music, and the mysteries of life on the frontier. I've been thinking, Clara said one morning, spreading jam on her biscuit with careful precision, about expanding the music program. There are families within a day's ride who might appreciate lessons for their children, and I could easily accommodate more students. You're not overwhelmed already? Silas asked, genuinely concerned. You're teaching 6 children now, plus helping with correspondence and household accounts. I'm not overwhelmed, Clara assured him. I'm energized. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm building something meaningful instead of just surviving day to day. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Silas found himself caught up in her vision. What would you need? Transportation? A larger space for lessons? Actually, Clara said, her eyes bright with excitement, I was thinking about the old bunkhouse. It's been empty for 2 years now, and it's large enough to accommodate group lessons. If we could fix it up, turn it into a proper music room, we could start a real music program here. The idea appealed to Silas immediately. The bunkhouse had been built for seasonal workers, but had sat empty since he'd reduced his crew. Converting it into a music room would give Clara the space she needed while creating something positive from an unused building. I'll have the men start work on it next week, he decided. We'll need to insulate it properly, install a good stove, maybe put in some proper windows for light. And we'll need to move the piano, Clara added. This one in the parlor is too precious to move around, but I saw an upright in the barn that might work with some restoration. Sarah's old piano, Silas said, remembering. She played it when she was young, before we could afford the Steinway. I'd forgotten it was out there. Nothing is ever truly forgotten, Clara said gently. Sometimes it just waits for the right moment to be remembered again. That afternoon, Silas found himself in the barn with Red Murphy, examining the dusty, upright piano that had been stored there for years. It was in better condition than he'd expected, the wood still solid despite its neglect. "Needs tuning and some minor repairs," Red observed, running his hands over the keys. "But it's got good bones. Miss Clara could probably make it sing again." "She seems to have a gift for that," Silas agreed, "making things sing that have been silent too long." Red glanced at him with knowing eyes. "Including you, boss. Haven't seen you smile this much in 3 years." The comment caught Silas off guard. Had he been smiling more? He supposed he had been, though he hadn't been conscious of it. Clara's presence had that effect. She brought lightness to even ordinary moments, found reasons for joy in the simplest things. "She's good for this place," he said finally. "Good for all of us." "That she is," Red agreed. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you going to let her stay here forever as just a music teacher, or are you going to admit that you're falling for her?" Silas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "It's not like that, Red. We're partners, colleagues. I'm helping her establish her teaching practice, and she's bringing music back to the ranch. That's all." Red's knowing smile suggested he wasn't convinced. "If you say so, boss. But I've been watching you both, and I've seen the way you look at her when you think nobody's watching. I've also seen the way she listens for your step on the porch, how her face lights up when you walk into a room." "You're imagining things," Silas said, but even as he spoke the words, he wondered if they were true. Was he falling for Clara? And if so, what did that mean for their carefully constructed partnership? That evening, as Clara played her usual concert in the parlor, Silas found himself studying her face in the lamplight. There was something ethereal about her when she played, as if the music transported her to a place where earthly concerns couldn't touch her. Her fingers moved across the keys with absolute confidence, drawing melodies from the instrument that seemed to speak directly to his soul. When she finished, she turned toward him with that radiant smile that had become so familiar. "What did you think of that one? It's a piece I've been working on, something I composed myself." "It was beautiful," he said, and meant it, sad and hopeful at the same time. "That's exactly what I was hoping for," Clara replied. "It's called After the Storm, about finding peace and new beginnings after a time of darkness." The title seemed to capture something essential about both their situations. They were both emerging from their own storms, finding new possibilities in the aftermath of loss and disappointment. "Clara," Silas said impulsively, "I want you to know how much your being here means to me. Not just the music, but your companionship, your perspective on things. You've changed this place for the better." Clara's expression grew soft, and she reached out to touch his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair. "You've changed my life too, Silas. You've given me something I never expected, to have a real home, a place where I belong. I'll never be able to repay that kindness." "You already have," he said quietly. "Every day, in 100 small ways." Their hands remained touching for a long moment, and Silas felt the stirring of something that went beyond friendship or partnership. It was too soon, too complicated, fraught with the memory of Sarah and the uncertainty of what Clara might feel in return. But it was there, undeniable and growing stronger with each passing day. Perhaps Red was right. Perhaps he was falling for Clara Bell. And perhaps, judging by the way she was looking at him in the soft lamplight, she might be falling for him too. The October morning brought with it the first hard frost of the season, and Clara woke to find the world transformed outside her bedroom window. She couldn't see the silver coating on the grass or the delicate ice crystals on the window pane, but she could feel the sharp change in the air's texture, could hear the different quality of sound that came with winter's approach. From downstairs came the familiar sounds of Silas, preparing for the day, the quiet clink of coffee cups, the gentle scrape of chairs, the soft thud of boots on wooden floors. These sounds had become as comforting to her as any lullaby, marking the rhythm of a life that had grown more precious to her than she dared admit. She dressed carefully, choosing a deep blue dress that Martha Henderson had assured her brought out her eyes, though Clara herself could only guess at the effect. The mirror above her washstand reflected an image she couldn't see but somehow felt a woman transformed by months of contentment, her face softer than it had been in years, her posture straighter with newfound confidence. Downstairs, she found Silas standing by the kitchen window, his coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared out at something that held his attention completely. Clara paused in the doorway, sensing a tension in his stillness that hadn't been there the night before. "What is it?" she asked softly. Silas turned, and she heard the reluctance in his movement. "There's a portrait hanging in the parlor," he said finally, "above the mantel. It's been there since Sarah died, and I haven't been able to bring myself to move it." Clara felt her heart constrict. In all the weeks she'd been playing piano in that room, she'd somehow avoided confronting the obvious presence of his deceased wife's image watching over them. "You want to take it down?" "I don't know what I want," Silas admitted, his voice rough with confusion. "It feels like betrayal, but it also feels like I'm keeping us all trapped in the past. Sarah, you, me." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Clara moved carefully across the kitchen, her fingers finding the edge of the table, then his arm. "Show me," she said simply. In the parlor, Clara stood before the mantel while Silas described what she couldn't see. "She was beautiful," he said, his voice tender with memory. "Brown hair, warm brown eyes, a smile that could light up the darkest day. She's wearing her wedding dress in the portrait we had it painted for our first anniversary." Clara reached up, her fingers tracing the ornate frame, feeling the weight of years and grief that surrounded this image. "What would she want?" she asked quietly. "I don't know anymore," Silas confessed. "I used to think I knew exactly what she'd want, but now—" He paused, struggling with words. "Now I think maybe she'd want me to stop using her memory as an excuse to avoid living." The admission was painful in its honesty, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Silas, I'm falling in love with you," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't want to, didn't mean to, but it's happening anyway. And I don't know how to reconcile that with the guilt I feel about Sarah, about moving on, about—" Clara's hand found his face, her fingers tracing the lines of worry and grief that had carved themselves there over 3 years of mourning. "Love isn't betrayal," she said softly. "Love is the most honest thing we can offer each other. But what if I'm not ready? What if I can never love anyone the way I loved her?" "Then you'll love me differently," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Sarah was your first love, your young love, the mother of dreams you thought you'd fulfill together. That was beautiful and precious, and nothing will ever diminish it. But that doesn't mean your heart is finished loving." Silas pulled her into his arms then, and Clara felt the tremor in his embrace, the weight of 3 years' loneliness and confusion finally finding release. They stood together in the shadow of Sarah's portrait, 2 wounded souls, discovering that healing was possible, that new love didn't require the erasure of old love. "I want to court you properly," Silas said when they finally drew apart. "If you'll have me, I want to do this right, to honor both you and Sarah's memory." Clara's smile was radiant. "I'd like that very much." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their tender moment, and Clara heard Silas curse softly under his breath. Through the window, she could see nothing, but she could hear the voices, multiple riders, their tones aggressive and demanding. "Who is it?" she asked, sensing the tension that had suddenly filled Silas's frame. "Tom Bell and his sons," Silas replied grimly. "Your father and brothers, Clara. They've found you." Clara's blood turned to ice. She had always known this moment might come, but she'd allowed herself to hope that her family had accepted her choice to leave and would let her live in peace. Apparently, that hope had been naive. "Miss Clara Bell." The voice that boomed across the yard was one she remembered all too well, her father's commanding baritone, now edged with anger and indignation. "You come out here this instant." Silas moved protectively in front of her. You don't have to face them if you don't want to. Yes, I do, Clara said, drawing herself up with the dignity that had carried her through every crisis of her adult life. They're my family, and they've come a long way. But Silas, she turned toward him, her hand finding his arm. Whatever they say, whatever they threaten, remember that I chose to be here. I chose you. Together, they walked out onto the front porch, Clara's hand tucked firmly into the crook of Silas's arm. Her father sat astride a large bay horse, flanked by her two older brothers, James and William. Even without sight, she could feel their disapproval radiating across the yard like heat from a forge. Clara, her father said, his voice stern with barely controlled fury, what is the meaning of this shameful display? Living unmarried in the house of a strange man, behaving like a common— Careful, Tom, Silas interrupted, his voice deceptively calm. You're speaking about a lady, and you're standing on my land. Your land? James Bell spat. You mean the land you stole from honest families? I bought this land fair and square from the bank after the previous owner defaulted on his loans, Silas replied evenly. I have all the paperwork to prove it. Paperwork can be forged, William added. We know what kind of man you are, McGraw, rich enough to buy whatever you want, including judges and bank officials. Clara felt the conversation spiraling toward dangerous territory. Stop this, she said firmly, stepping forward. Father, why are you here? What do you want? I want my daughter to come home where she belongs, Tom Bell replied. I want her to stop this foolishness and accept the life God intended for her. And what life is that? Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Marcus Whitman is still willing to marry you, despite your scandalous behavior. He's a good man, a patient man, and he'll provide for you properly. You'll have security, respectability, a place in society. I have those things already, Clara replied calmly. I have work that I love, a home where I'm valued, and the respect of the community. What more could I want? A husband, her father said bluntly. Children, a proper Christian life instead of this sinful arrangement. My arrangement with Mr. McGraw is entirely proper, Clara said, her cheeks burning with indignation. I am his employee and guest, nothing more. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she wasn't about to discuss her private feelings with men who had forfeited the right to her confidences years ago. Employee? James laughed harshly. What kind of work could a blind woman possibly do that would be worth room and board in a house like this? I teach music, Clara said proudly. I have 12 students, and I'm planning to expand the program further. I support myself through my own talents and efforts. Music lessons, William scoffed. That's not real work. That's a hobby, a pastime for people with too much money and not enough sense. Silas stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. Gentlemen, I think it's time for you to leave. Clara is a grown woman who's capable of making her own decisions about her life. She's our family, Tom Bell said fiercely. Our responsibility, and we won't stand by and watch her destroy herself with this foolish independence. I'm not destroying myself, Clara said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. I'm building myself. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I want to do. Why can't you understand that? Because you're a woman, her father replied bluntly. Because God made you to be protected and provided for, not to fend for yourself in a world that will take advantage of your weakness. My blindness isn't weakness, Clara shot back. And my gender isn't a limitation. I'm stronger than you ever gave me credit for, and I'm happier than I've ever been in my life. The argument continued for another 20 minutes, growing more heated with each exchange. Clara's family demanded that she return with them immediately, while she steadfastly refused to abandon the life she'd built. Silas remained a protective presence at her side, interjecting only when the conversation became too personal or insulting. Finally, Tom Bell played his last card. Clara, if you don't come home with us today, you'll be dead to this family. No more letters, no more contact of any kind. You'll be completely alone in the world. The threat hit its mark, and Clara felt her resolve waver for just a moment. To be truly orphaned, To have no family at all, it was a frightening prospect. But then she felt Silas's hand squeeze hers, heard the supportive murmur of ranch hands who had gathered nearby, and she remembered all the reasons she'd chosen this new life. "Then I'll be alone," she said quietly, "but I'll be free, and I'll be myself." Her father's face, which she couldn't see but could feel in the sudden silence, must have shown his shock and disappointment. When he spoke again, his voice was cold with finality. "So be it. You've made your choice, Clara. May God forgive you for it, because your family never will." The sound of departing horses gradually faded, leaving Clara and Silas standing together on the porch in the aftermath of a confrontation that had changed everything between them. Clara was shaking, whether from anger or grief or relief she couldn't say, and Silas drew her close against his chest. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I'm sorry they put you through that." "Don't be sorry," Clara replied, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I meant what I said. I chose this. I chose you, and I'd make the same choice again, no matter what the cost." Above them, Sarah's portrait looked down from the parlor window, but for the first time since her death, Silas felt no guilt about holding another woman in his arms. Sarah would have understood, he realized. She would have wanted him to find love again, to find someone who could share the life he'd built in her memory. And Clara, brave, independent, remarkable Clara had chosen to share that life with him, despite the price it cost her. It was a gift more precious than anything he could have imagined, and he intended to spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of it. The days following her family's visit brought an unexpected peace to the ranch, as if the confrontation had cleared the air of unspoken tensions. Clara threw herself into her music with renewed vigor, and Silas found excuses to linger near the house whenever she played. The portrait of Sarah had been quietly moved to his bedroom, where it held a place of honor but no longer presided over their growing relationship. It was during this period of tentative courtship that Clara made a discovery that would change everything she thought she knew about her circumstances. She was exploring the converted bunkhouse that had become her music room, running her hands along the newly installed shelves, when her fingers encountered something unexpected tucked behind a loose board. "Silas," she called, her voice tight with curiosity. "Could you come here for a moment?" He appeared in the doorway almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting for her summons. "What is it?" "There's something hidden behind this board. Papers, I think. Could you help me get them out?" Silas pried the board loose with his knife, revealing a small space that contained a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth. As he unfolded the papers, his sharp intake of breath told Clara that whatever he was seeing had shocked him. "What is it?" she asked, her heart beginning to race. "Legal documents," Silas said slowly. "Deeds, contracts, correspondence. Clara, these papers, they're about this land, about your grandfather's property." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "My grandfather." According to this, Samuel Bell owned the section of land that includes this ranch house and about 5,000 acres around it. He mortgaged the property in 1873 to cover debts from a bad cattle deal, then died before he could make the payments. Clara sank onto a nearby chair, her mind reeling. "But that's impossible. My family never mentioned owning land out here." "Maybe they didn't know," Silas suggested gently. "Or maybe they chose not to tell you. But Clara, there's more. These documents suggest that the bank sale wasn't entirely legitimate. Your grandfather's mortgage was sold to a man named Harrison Pike, who then manipulated the default proceedings to acquire the land for far less than its value." "And you bought it from Pike?" "No," Silas said, his voice growing troubled. "I bought it from the Territorial Bank in Cheyenne. But according to these papers, Pike sold it to them after holding it for only 6 months. Clara, I think your grandfather was cheated out of this land, and your family never knew they had a rightful claim to it." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Her family had disowned her for choosing to live on land that had once belonged to them, land that might still be rightfully theirs. The irony was so bitter it made her stomach turn. "Does this mean—" she began, then stopped, unable to finish the question. "It means the legal ownership of this ranch is more complicated than either of us realized," Silas said carefully. "But Clara, regardless of what these papers say, this is your home now. Nothing changes that." "Everything changes that," Clara whispered. "Don't you see? My family could contest your ownership. They could take this place away from you, destroy everything you've built." "Let them try," Silas said firmly. "I've invested 15 years of my life and every dollar I've earned into this ranch. I won't give it up without a fight." Clara stood abruptly, pacing to the window with agitated steps. "This is exactly what my father was talking about when he accused you of stealing land from honest families. What if he somehow knew about this? What if that's why they came here?" "Clara, listen to me," Silas said, crossing to take her hands in his. "Even if your family has a legal claim to some of this land, it doesn't change how I feel about you. It doesn't change what we're building together." "Doesn't it?" Clara pulled away from him, her emotions a tangle of confusion and guilt. "How can we build a life together on land that was stolen from my family? How can I be happy here knowing that my grandfather's dreams died to make your dreams possible?" The question hung between them like a chasm. Silas had no ready answer, no easy way to reconcile the competing claims of justice and love, past and present. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. "Together. There has to be a way to make this right for everyone." "What if there isn't?" Clara asked, her voice small and frightened. "What if I have to choose between you and my family's rightful inheritance?" It was a question that would haunt them both in the days that followed. Clara threw herself into research, having Silas read through every document they'd found, trying to piece together the full story of her grandfather's financial troubles and the land's subsequent ownership. What they discovered was a tale of manipulation and corruption that made Clara's heart ache for the grandfather she'd barely known. Samuel Bell had been a dreamer, a man who'd seen the potential in Wyoming's grasslands and invested everything he had in building a cattle empire. But a harsh winter and falling beef prices had left him desperate for cash, and he'd mortgaged his land to cover immediate debts with the intention of paying it off when times improved. Harrison Pike, however, had had other plans. As Clara and Silas discovered through the hidden correspondence, Pike had deliberately accelerated the mortgage's default timeline and bribed bank officials to expedite the foreclosure proceedings. Samuel Bell had died, thinking he'd failed his family, never knowing that he'd been the victim of a calculated scheme. "It's not your fault," Clara told Silas one evening as they sat in the parlor, the damning documents spread across the coffee table between them. "You had no way of knowing the land's history when you bought it." "But I benefited from the theft," Silas replied, his voice heavy with guilt. "Everything I've built here, everything I am, is founded on your family's loss." "And my family's loss was founded on one man's greed," Clara pointed out. "Harrison Pike is the villain in this story, not you." "Pike's been dead for 5 years," Silas said bitterly. "There's no justice to be had from him." The weight of the discovery was affecting them both, casting a shadow over the happiness they'd found together. Clara's music became melancholy, filled with minor keys and unresolved harmonies. Silas grew withdrawn, spending long hours riding the boundaries of the ranch as if trying to memorize every inch of land he might soon lose. It was Red Murphy who finally forced them to confront the situation directly. The grizzled foreman appeared at the house one evening, his hat in his hands and his expression unusually serious. "Boss," he said to Silas, "I need to talk to you and Miss Clara. There's been developments." They gathered in the kitchen, where Red's weathered face looked older than his 50-odd years. "Word's gotten around about them papers you found," he began. "Don't know how, but folks are talking, and some of them are taking sides." "What kind of sides?" Clara asked, though she feared she already knew. "Well, there's those who figure Mr. McGraw's been a good neighbor and fair employer, and they don't want to see him lose everything over something that happened before he got here. But there's others who think justice needs to be served, that the Bell family got cheated and ought to get their property back." Silas rubbed his temples wearily. "What are you trying to tell us, Red?" "I'm telling you that Clara's father has been in town asking questions." And I'm telling you that there's a lawyer from Cheyenne been sniffing around, looking into land records and making inquiries about contested claims. The news hit Clara like a blow. My father's hired a lawyer? Seems so, and word is, he's got a strong case. Might be that this whole thing's going to end up in court, whether you two want it to or not. Clara felt the walls of her carefully constructed new life beginning to crumble. The legal battle that was brewing would tear apart not just her relationship with Silas, but the entire community that had welcomed her. Friends and neighbors would be forced to choose sides, and no matter who won, the cost would be devastating. There's something else, Red continued reluctantly. The lawyer's been asking about Miss Clara specifically, about her living arrangements here, her relationship with you, boss. I think they're planning to use her presence here as evidence of impropriety. They're going to destroy my reputation to win their case, Clara said, understanding immediately. The strategy was clever and cruel, paint her as a fallen woman whose testimony couldn't be trusted, while simultaneously suggesting that Silas had taken advantage of her vulnerability. We won't let them, Silas said fiercely. I'll marry you tomorrow if that's what it takes to protect your good name. A marriage of convenience won't fool anyone, Clara replied sadly. And it won't change the legal facts. My grandfather was cheated, and you ended up with his land. That's the truth, regardless of our personal feelings. So what do we do? Silas asked. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her mind working through possibilities and consequences. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, despite the pain she felt. We face it honestly, she said. We tell the truth about everything, about the land, about us, about what we've built here together, and we let justice take its course, whatever that might mean. Even if it means losing everything, Silas asked. Even if it means losing everything, Clara confirmed, because living with lies and stolen ground isn't really living at all. In the silence that followed, they could hear the wind picking up outside, carrying with it the promise of the harsh winter to come. Soon, the snows would isolate the ranch from the outside world, giving them a few months of peace before the legal battle began in earnest. But for now, they had each other, and they had the truth. It would have to be enough to sustain them through whatever trials lay ahead. The blizzard struck with the fury of a living thing, transforming the Wyoming landscape into a white wasteland where the boundary between earth and sky disappeared entirely. For 3 days, snow fell in sheets so thick that Clara couldn't hear her own footsteps when she walked from room to room in the house. The wind howled like a banshee around the eaves, and even the usually unflappable ranch hands huddled close to the bunkhouse stove, venturing out only to check on the livestock in the nearby barns. Silas and Clara found themselves truly alone together for the first time since her arrival. The isolation was complete. No students tramping through the snow for music lessons, no ranch business requiring Silas's attention beyond the essential care of animals, no possibility of visitors or interruptions. It was as if the storm had carved out a private world just for them, where the complications of land ownership and family disputes couldn't reach. On the second day of the blizzard, while Silas was checking on the horses in the barn, Clara decided to explore parts of the house she'd never thoroughly investigated. Her growing familiarity with the layout gave her confidence to venture into storage rooms and unused spaces, her fingers reading the contents of shelves and trunks with the skill of long practice. It was in a cedar chest, in what had once been Sarah's sewing room, that Clara made the discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about the land dispute. Her hands, searching through carefully preserved linens and keepsakes, encountered a leather portfolio tied with ribbon. Inside, her fingers found papers of a different texture than the documents they'd discovered in the music, room older, more fragile, with the distinctive feel of parchment that had been handled many times. "Silas!" she called, her voice sharp with excitement and alarm. "I need you to come up here immediately." He appeared within minutes, snow still dusting his shoulders from his trip to the barn. "What is it? You sound like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Clara said, holding out the portfolio with trembling hands. These papers were in Sarah's chest. I think they're about the land, but they're much older than the ones we found before. Silas took the portfolio and carefully untied the ribbon. As he unfolded the documents inside, Clara heard his sharp intake of breath, followed by a long, low whistle of amazement. "Clara," he said slowly, "these aren't just about the land. These papers, they show that Samuel Bell never actually owned the section where our house stands." "What do you mean?" "According to this original territorial survey, your grandfather's property was entirely to the east of here. The section we're living on was actually owned by a man named Joseph McGraw." Clara felt the world tilt around her. "McGraw? As in my grandfather?" Silas confirmed, his voice filled with wonder. "Joseph McGraw, who died in 1875. I never knew he owned land out here, my father always told me. The family came from Colorado originally." Clara sank into a nearby chair, her mind reeling. "But that means..." "It means Harrison Pike didn't just cheat your grandfather out of his land," Silas said, studying the documents more carefully. "He cheated my grandfather too, and somehow he managed to combine both properties and sell them as a single parcel to the bank. The implications were staggering. Pike had apparently orchestrated a massive fraud, acquiring property from two different families through manipulation and deceit, then covering his tracks so thoroughly that neither family knew of the other's legitimate claim. "There's more," Silas said, his voice growing more amazed with each revelation. "According to this deed, Joseph McGraw and Samuel Bell were partners. They owned adjacent properties and worked them together as a single operation. Clara, our grandfathers knew each other. They were friends." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. The beautiful irony of it was almost too much to comprehend, that she and Silas should find each other across the decades, drawn together by love and circumstance, only to discover that their families had been connected long before either of them was born. "Look at this," Silas continued, unfolding what appeared to be a letter. "It's from Samuel Bell to Joseph McGraw, dated 1874. He's writing about the drought that year, and about their plans to help each other through the hard times." Silas read aloud. "My dear Joseph, these have been trying months for both our families, but I remain confident that by working together we can weather this storm as we have others. Your suggestion about combining our herds for the winter makes good sense, and Mary has agreed that your Sarah and the children should stay with us until the new house is completed. It seems fitting that our properties should one day be united in truth, as they are already united in friendship and mutual purpose." "They were planning to join the properties," Clara whispered. "Our grandfathers wanted their lands to be worked as one." "There's more," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Listen to this part. I have been thinking about the future, about what legacy we might leave for our children and grandchildren. Perhaps it is foolish sentiment, but I cannot help but hope that someday a McGraw and a Bell might find the same partnership in marriage that you and I have found in business. Wouldn't that be a fine thing, to see our families truly united?" Clara began to laugh through her tear-snot from humor, but from the sheer, overwhelming beauty of fate's design. Samuel Bell hoped a McGraw and a Bell would marry someday. "And here we are," Silas said softly, "fulfilling a dream our grandfathers shared more than 50 years ago." The discovery transformed everything they thought they knew about their situation. Far from being a tragic case of stolen land dividing two families, the truth was that Pike had stolen from both families, and that the rightful resolution was exactly what Clara and Silas had unknowingly been, building a union that honored both their grandfather's dreams and their own hearts. "We have to tell my father," Clara said suddenly, "and the lawyer. This changes everything." "Does it?" Silas asked. "Your family still believes I cheated them. They're not going to want to hear that we're meant to be together because our grandfathers planned it." Clara considered this, her practical mind working through the complications. "You're right. They'll think we manufactured this evidence to support our case." "But Silas, these documents prove that both our families were victims of the same crime. Surely that has to count for something." "Maybe," Silas said doubtfully. "But your father didn't seem like a man inclined to listen to reason when he was here before." Clara stood and began pacing, her cane tapping against the floorboards as she worked through the problem. "We need an independent voice," she said finally. "Someone with legal expertise who can verify these documents and present the facts objectively." "The territorial judge," Silas suggested. "Judge Morrison has a reputation for fairness, and he knew both our grandfathers back in the day. If anyone can sort through this mess, it's him." "But the storm." "The storm will pass," Silas said firmly. "And when it does, we'll ride to town together and present our case properly. No more secrets, no more half-truths. We'll lay out everything we know and let justice take its course." That evening, as the wind continued to howl outside and snow piled against the windows, Clara and Silas sat by the fire and carefully read through every document they'd discovered. The picture that emerged was of two families, bound together by friendship and mutual respect, and of one man's greed that had torn apart that bond and stolen the legacy both families should have shared. "I keep thinking about Sarah," Clara said as they finished examining the last of the papers. "She lived here for years, surrounded by her grandmother's things, never knowing that this had all been meant to bring our families together." "Maybe she did know in some way," Silas replied thoughtfully. "Maybe that's why she insisted on preserving all these documents instead of throwing them away. Maybe she sensed that someday they'd be important." Clara reached for his hand across the space between their chairs. "Do you think she would have approved? Of us, I mean." Silas was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I think she would have been happy that the music came back to the house," he said finally. "And I think she would have understood that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies." Outside, the storm began to show signs of weakening, the wind's howl dropping to a more manageable moan. By morning, Clara knew the world would be buried under several feet of snow, but the sun would be shining and the worst of the weather would have passed. And then, the real work would begin, the work of presenting their discoveries to Clara's family and the community, of fighting for the truth about what had happened to both their grandfathers, and of claiming the future that Samuel Bell and Joseph McGraw had dreamed of for their descendants. It would be a difficult battle, Clara knew. Her father was proud and stubborn, and he'd already committed himself to a course of action that painted Silas as the villain. Convincing him to see the truth would require patience, diplomacy, and possibly divine intervention. But they had something more powerful than pride or stubbornness working in their favor. They had love, and they had truth, and they had the blessing of two men who'd understood, more than half a century ago, that some bonds were meant to transcend the boundaries of property and family name. As Clara fell asleep that night to the sound of gradually diminishing wind, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced since the land dispute had first come to light. Whatever happened in the days ahead, she and Silas would face it together, united not just by their own choices, but by the dreams of the men who'd come before them. The storm was ending, and with its passing, a new chapter of their story was about to begin. The morning after the blizzard dawned crystal clear and brutally cold, with snow drifted so high against the house that Silas had to dig a path to reach the barn. But even as he worked to clear essential pathways, his mind was focused on the journey they would make to town as soon as the roads became passable. The documents they'd discovered changed everything, but he knew that presenting their case would require careful planning and diplomatic skill. Clara spent the morning organizing their evidence. Having Silas read each document aloud while she took notes in her own system of raised dots on paper, a method she'd developed years ago for keeping track of important information. Her methodical approach helped them construct a timeline of events that clearly showed how Harrison Pike had manipulated both families and stolen their grandfather's legacy. "We need to approach Judge Morrison first," Clara said as they worked, "before my father or his lawyer can present their version of events. If the judge understands the full scope of Pike's fraud, he'll be better equipped to mediate between our families." "That makes sense," Silas agreed. "But Clara, are you prepared for the possibility that your father won't accept this evidence? He's invested a lot of time and money in pursuing this legal action. Men like your father don't change their minds easily, especially when their pride is involved. Clara's fingers paused in their note-taking. I know my father is stubborn, but he's also fundamentally honest. If we can prove that both our grandfathers were victims of the same crime, surely he'll see that continuing this feud serves no one's interests. I hope you're right, Silas said, though his tone suggested he harbored serious doubts. But we need to be prepared for the worst-case scenario. What if he refuses to believe the documents are authentic? What if he thinks we forged them to support our case? The question hung heavy between them. Clara had been trying not to think about that possibility, but she knew it was realistic. Her father had already demonstrated his willingness to believe the worst about both her and Silas. Convincing him to accept evidence that painted them as star-crossed lovers, fulfilling their grandfather's dreams, might be more than his suspicious nature could accommodate. Then we'll have to let the law decide, Clara said finally. Judge Morrison can have the documents authenticated by experts. Handwriting analysis, paper dating, verification of official seals there are ways to prove these papers are genuine. 3 days passed before the roads were clear enough for travel, and during that time, word somehow reached them that Clara's father and his lawyer had not been idle. Red Murphy, who'd made the hazardous journey from town on horseback, brought news that made Clara's heart sink. They've filed formal papers, Red reported, his face grim as he warmed himself by the kitchen stove, claiming ownership of the entire ranch based on Samuel Bell's original land grant. They're saying that any subsequent sales were fraudulent and that the property should revert to the Bell family. All of it? Silas asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Even the sections that belonged to my grandfather? All of it, Red confirmed. Near as I can tell, they're claiming that Pike's fraud invalidates every transaction that came after, which would include your purchase from the bank. They want the whole thing. Clara felt sick. This wasn't about justice or righting historical wrongs. This was about greed and revenge. Her father wasn't trying to recover his own family's stolen property. He was trying to steal Silas's as well. There's more, Red continued reluctantly. They've also filed a complaint about Miss Clara's living arrangements, claiming that her presence here is evidence of improper conduct that calls into question any testimony she might offer. They're trying to destroy my reputation to weaken our case, Clara said, her voice flat with resignation. Just as we predicted. We won't let them, Silas said fiercely. Clara, if you'll have me, I want to marry you. Today, if possible. A wife can't be compelled to testify against her husband, and it will put an end to any questions about impropriety. Clara turned toward him, her heart aching with love and gratitude, but also with the weight of impossible choices. Silas, I won't have you marry me just to protect me from my father's vindictiveness. When we marry, if we marry, it should be because we both want to spend our lives together, not because we're trying to win a legal battle. You think I'm proposing out of legal strategy? Silas asked, his voice hurt. Clara, I've been wanting to propose since the night your family came here. The only thing that stopped me is the uncertainty about the land. I didn't want you to think I was trying to use marriage to strengthen my claim to property that might rightfully belong to your family. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. You've wanted to marry me? I've wanted to marry you since the day you first played piano in my parlor, Silas confessed. Maybe since the day you told Daisy she was beautiful and meant it. I love you, Clara. Not because of this land dispute, not because of our grandfather's friendship, but because you're the most remarkable woman I've ever known. And I love you, Clara replied, her voice thick with emotion. But I need to know that our marriage won't be tainted by all this legal mess. I need to know that we're choosing each other freely, not because circumstances are forcing our hand. Red cleared his throat diplomatically. Maybe I should leave you two to sort this out privately. But before I go, there's one more thing you should know. Judge Morrison wants to see both of you in his chambers tomorrow morning. He's heard about the competing claims, and he wants to review the evidence before this thing gets any further out of hand. After Red departed, Silas and Clara spent the evening in deep conversation about their future. The marriage proposal hung between them, complicated by the circumstances, but also made more precious by the honesty with which they'd discussed their feelings. "I have an idea," Clara said finally. "What if we present our evidence to Judge Morrison tomorrow and let him make his ruling about the land dispute? Once that's settled, whatever the outcome then, we can make our decision about marriage based on our hearts rather than legal strategy. And if the judge rules that your family has a valid claim to the property, then we'll find another way to build our life together," Clara said firmly. "The land doesn't make us who we are, Silas. Our love does. Even if it means starting over with nothing." Clara reached for his hands, holding them tightly. "We won't have nothing. We'll have each other, and we'll have the truth about our grandfather's friendship. That's a foundation strong enough to build any kind of life on." The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect for the journey to town. As they prepared to leave, Clara carefully packed the precious documents in a leather satchel, handling them with the reverence due to artifacts that might determine their entire future. Silas hitched up the sleigh, and they set out across the snow-covered prairie with a sense of approaching destiny. Whatever happened in Judge Morrison's chambers would determine not just the ownership of the ranch, but the course of their entire lives together. "Are you nervous?" Silas asked as they neared the outskirts of town. "Terrified," Clara admitted, "but also hopeful. For the first time since this all began, I feel like we're finally going to get to tell the whole truth." As they pulled up in front of the courthouse, Clara could see her father's wagon already there, along with a fancy carriage that presumably belonged to his lawyer. The moment of confrontation had arrived, and despite her fear, Clara felt a surge of determination. She and Silas had the truth on their side, note, just the legal truth about property ownership, but the deeper truth about love, transcending the boundaries of family feuds and historical grievances. It remained to be seen whether truth would be enough to overcome pride, greed, and years of accumulated bitterness. But as Silas helped her down from the sleigh and offered her his arm, Clara felt strengthened by the knowledge that whatever happened, they would face it together. Their grandfathers had dreamed of uniting their families, and perhaps today, that dream would finally come true, not through legal maneuvering or political alliance, but through the simple, powerful act of two people choosing love over division. The courthouse doors loomed before them, and beyond those doors waited either vindication or devastation. Clara squeezed Silas's arm and stepped forward to meet her fate. Judge Morrison's chambers smelled of leather, tobacco, and the accumulated wisdom of 30 years on the territorial bench. Clara entered the room on Silas's arm, her heart pounding as she sensed the tension that crackled between the opposing parties already assembled there. Her father's voice, when he spoke her name, was cold as winter wind. "Clara." Tom Bell's tone held no warmth, no acknowledgement of the familial bond they'd once shared. "I see you've chosen to ally yourself with the man who stole our family's birthright." "Father," Clara replied, keeping her voice steady despite the pain his coldness caused. "I've chosen to ally myself with the truth. Judge Morrison, a man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for courtroom dramatics, rapped his gavel once. "We'll have order in my chambers. Mr. Bell, Mr. McGraw, Miss Bell, please be seated. Mr. Whitmore." He addressed the lawyer Clara's father had hired. "I understand you've filed a claim disputing ownership of the McGraw Ranch property." "That's correct, Your Honor," Whitmore replied, a thin man with calculating eyes. "My client has documentary evidence proving that his father, Samuel Bell, was the rightful owner of the disputed land, and that subsequent sales were fraudulent." "And Mr. McGraw," the judge continued, "I understand you dispute this claim." "I do, Your Honor," Silas replied firmly. "Moreover, we have new evidence that casts the entire situation in a different light." Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying the assembled parties with keen eyes. "Very well. Mr. Whitmore, present your case first." Clara listened with growing dismay as her father's lawyer painted a picture of Silas as a man who'd knowingly purchased stolen property and then compounded his crime by seducing the blind daughter of the rightful owner. Whitmore's presentation was skillful and damaging, designed to portray the Bell family as innocent victims and Silas as a calculating opportunist. "Your Honor," Whitmore concluded, "my client seeks not only the return of his family's property, but damages for the years of lost income and the corruption of his daughter's virtue." Clara felt her cheeks burn with indignation, but she forced herself to remain silent. Her father was clearly prepared to destroy her reputation completely in order to win his case. "Mr. McGraw," Judge Morrison said, "your response?" Silas stood, and Clara heard the rustle of papers as he opened their carefully prepared evidence folder. "Your Honor, the truth is far more complex than Mr. Whitmore has presented. Miss Bell and I have discovered documents that prove both our families were victims of the same criminal conspiracy." For the next 20 minutes, Silas methodically presented their findings. He read from Samuel Bell's letters to Joseph McGraw, described the partnership between their grandfathers, and detailed Harrison Pike's elaborate fraud. Clara could sense the judge's growing interest, and even her father's lawyer seemed taken aback by the thoroughness of their evidence. "These documents," Silas said, holding up the original territorial survey, "prove that Samuel Bell never owned the section where my ranch house currently stands. That land belonged to my grandfather, Joseph McGraw. Pike stole from both our families and then combined the properties illegally." "Forgery," Whitmore objected immediately. "Your Honor, these documents are clearly fabricated to support Mr. McGraw's fraudulent claim." Judge Morrison held up his hand for silence. "Miss Bell," he said, addressing Clara directly for the first time, "these documents were found in your current residence. What is your understanding of their authenticity?" Clara rose, her cane tapping softly against the floor as she faced the judge. "Your Honor, I discovered these papers in a cedar chest that belonged to Sarah McGraw, Mr. McGraw's deceased wife. They were preserved alongside her personal effects and family heirlooms. I believe they are genuine documents that Sarah kept because she understood their historical importance." "And your personal relationship with Mr. McGraw?" the judge asked pointedly. "How does that affect your testimony?" Clara lifted her chin proudly. "Mr. McGraw and I are not married, Your Honor, but we are committed to building a life together. I won't pretend that my feelings for him don't influence my perspective, but they don't change the facts. These documents tell the truth about what happened to both our families. She's been corrupted by him." Tom Bell burst out, his composure finally cracking. "My daughter was an innocent woman before she fell under this man's influence. How can you trust the word of someone who's been living in sin?" "I have not been living in sin," Clara replied firmly, turning toward her father's voice. "I have been living as an independent woman who earns her keep through honest work. And I have been discovering the truth about our family's history, truth that you apparently would rather suppress in favor of a profitable lie." "Profitable lie," her father sputtered. "That land was stolen from us." "Part of it was," Clara agreed, "but not all of it, and the solution isn't to steal from the McGraw family the way Harrison Pike stole from ours." Judge Morrison was studying the documents with intense concentration. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to need time to have these papers authenticated by experts. The handwriting, the paper, the official seals, everything will need to be verified before I can make a ruling." "Your Honor," Whitmore protested, "surely you don't intend to delay justice based on obviously forged—" "Mr. Whitmore," the judge interrupted sharply, "I intend to base my ruling on facts, not accusations. Court is adjourned for 2 weeks while these documents are examined." As the formal proceedings ended, Clara felt her father approach. When he spoke, his voice was low and filled with hurt that cut deeper than anger. "Clara, I don't understand how you can choose a stranger over your own family." She turned toward him, her heart breaking at the pain she heard beneath his words. "I'm not choosing him over you, Father. I'm choosing truth over revenge. I'm choosing love over hatred. I'm choosing the future over the past." "He's bewitched you," Tom Bell said bitterly. "You can't see what he really is." "You're wrong," Clara replied gently. "I see him more clearly than you ever could. I see his kindness, his integrity, his capacity for love. I see the man our grandfather would have been proud to call family. Samuel Bell would be ashamed of what you've become. The accusation was meant to wound, and it did. But Clara drew strength from the letters they'd found, from the evidence of her grandfather's dreams and hopes for the future. Samuel Bell dreamed of our families being united, she said softly. He wrote about it in his own hand. He hoped that someday a McGraw and a Bell might find in marriage the same partnership he and Joseph McGraw had found in friendship. I'm fulfilling his dream, Father, not betraying it. Her father was silent for a long moment, and Clara hoped she might have reached him, but when he spoke again, his voice was as cold as ever. You have 2 weeks to come to your senses, he said. 2 weeks to remember who you are and where you came from. After that, if you continue with this foolishness, you'll no longer be my daughter. Clara felt Silas's hand find hers, offering comfort and support. I'm sorry it's come to this, she said to her father, but I won't sacrifice my happiness or Silas's future for your pride. As they left the courthouse, Clara leaned heavily on Silas's arm, emotionally drained by the confrontation. The next 2 weeks would determine everything, whether their evidence would be accepted, whether her father might find some capacity for forgiveness, whether their love would survive the legal and family pressures arrayed against it. Whatever happens, Silas said quietly as they walked to their sleigh, I want you to know that I'm proud of how you handled yourself in there. You were magnificent. I was terrified, Clara admitted, but I was also angry. How dare they suggest that our love is somehow shameful or corrupt? How dare they try to use my blindness and my gender to discredit the truth? They're desperate, Silas observed. People do desperate things when they're afraid of losing what they think they deserve. As they drove home through the crisp afternoon air, Clara found herself thinking about the wedding certificate she knew was tucked away in Silas's desk. Draw the blank document he'd obtained weeks ago when he'd first thought about proposing. Soon, perhaps very soon, they would need to decide whether to fill in those blank lines, regardless of what the court decided about the land. The battle was far from over, but Clara felt a cautious optimism building in her chest. They had the truth on their side, and they had each other. With those two foundations, they could weather whatever storms lay ahead. The 2 weeks that followed felt like the longest of Clara's life. Each day brought fresh worry about the authentication process, about what Judge Morrison would decide, about whether her father might somehow find his way to forgiveness. She threw herself into her music with desperate intensity, playing pieces that channeled all her anxiety and hope into melodies that seemed to fill the house with both sorrow and determination. On the morning they were to return to court, a knock at the door brought an unexpected visitor. Clara heard unfamiliar voices in the front hall, a woman and a man, both speaking with refined Eastern accents that seemed out of place in the Wyoming territory. Mr. McGraw, the woman was saying, my name is Catherine Morrison, and this is my colleague, Dr. Franklin Webster from the Smithsonian Institution. Judge Morrison asked us to examine some historical documents you'd discovered. Clara's heart leaped. These must be the experts the judge had brought in to authenticate their evidence. She hurried to the parlor, where Silas was already greeting their visitors. Miss Bell, Dr. Webster said as introductions were made, Judge Morrison tells me you were the one who discovered the documents in question. Remarkable find, if they prove to be authentic. Have you reached a conclusion? Clara asked, hardly daring to breathe. Catherine Morrison smiled. We have indeed. Dr. Webster, would you care to explain our findings? The historian cleared his throat formally. Miss Bell, Mr. McGraw, I'm pleased to inform you that every document you've presented is unquestionably genuine. The paper, the ink, the handwriting, the official seals, everything checks out perfectly. Moreover, we've been able to corroborate your findings with records from the territorial archives. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. So the evidence proves that both our grandfathers were defrauded. Beyond any doubt, Dr. Webster confirmed. Harrison Pike was even more audacious than you realized. We've found evidence that he perpetrated similar frauds throughout the territory, always targeting families who were struggling financially or dealing with personal crises that made them vulnerable. There's more, Catherine Morrison added. We've also found documentation that proves Pike bribed several bank officials and at least one territorial judge to facilitate his schemes. Your case has opened up what may be the largest land fraud investigation in territorial history. The news was overwhelming in its implications. Not only had their evidence been validated, but their discovery might lead to justice for dozens of other families who'd been victimized by Pike's criminal enterprise. "What does this mean for the current legal dispute?" Silas asked. "Judge Morrison will have to make that determination," Webster replied. "But in our opinion, the evidence clearly shows that both the Bell and McGraw families have legitimate claims to different portions of the disputed property." As the experts departed, Clara and Silas sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they'd learned. Their personal struggle had become part of a much larger story of corruption and justice that would reverberate through the territory for years to come. "Clara," Silas said finally, "regardless of what the judge decides about the land, I want to ask you something I should have asked weeks ago." Clara turned toward him, her heart beginning to race at the serious tone in his voice. Silas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. I love your courage, your independence, your music, your laughter, your tears. I love the way you see the world with your heart instead of your eyes. Will you marry me, Clara? Will you be my wife, my partner, my companion, for whatever years God grants us?" Tears streamed down Clara's face as she looked toward the man who had become her whole world. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all my heart, yes." They kissed then, a kiss that tasted of tears and hope, and the promise of a future they would build together regardless of what any court might decide. At the courthouse that afternoon, Judge Morrison's chambers were packed with interested parties. Word had spread about the authentication results, and the case had attracted attention from throughout the territory. Clara entered on Silas's arm, her engagement ring a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother glinting on her finger. "Before I announce my ruling," Judge Morrison began, "I want to state for the record that this case has revealed one of the most extensive land fraud schemes in territorial history. Harrison Pike and his associates will be posthumously condemned, and their living descendants will face civil action to recover damages where possible." Clara felt her father shift uncomfortably in his chair. Tom Bell had remained steadfast in his hostility throughout the 2-week waiting period, but she wondered if the expert testimony might finally convince him that she and Silas had been telling the truth. "Now, as to the specific matter before this court," the judge continued, "I find that the evidence clearly establishes the following facts. First, that Samuel Bell was the rightful owner of approximately 2.0 acres in the eastern section of the disputed property. Second, that Joseph McGraw was the rightful owner of approximately 3.0 acres in the western section, including the current ranch house and primary buildings. Third, that Harrison Pike fraudulently acquired both properties and illegally combined them before selling to the territorial bank." Clara held her breath, waiting for the crucial determination. "Therefore," Judge Morrison announced, "I hereby rule that the Bell family has a valid claim to the eastern 2.0 acres, and that the McGraw family, represented by Silas McGraw's, a valid claim to the western 3.0 acres. The property should be divided according to the original territorial survey boundaries." The ruling was as fair as Clara could have hoped, but she knew it might not satisfy her father, who'd been seeking control of the entire ranch. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I find that Mr. McGraw purchased his portion of the property in good faith and has made substantial improvements to it over the course of 15 years. Therefore, while the Bell family is entitled to the eastern acreage, they are not entitled to damages or compensation from Mr. McGraw, who was as much a victim of Pike's fraud as they were." "Your Honor," Whitmore objected, "my client invested considerable resources in pursuing this matter. Surely some compensation is warranted." "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Morrison replied sharply, "your client will receive clear title to 2.0 acres of prime rangeland. That should be compensation enough for anyone." Clara felt a complex mixture of emotions as the legal proceedings concluded. Justice had been served, but at a personal cost that was still being calculated. Her father now had legal ownership of a substantial piece of property, but he'd also lost his daughter in the process of fighting for it. As people began filing out of the courthouse, Clara heard her father's heavy footsteps approaching. When he spoke, his voice was subdued, lacking the anger that had characterized their previous encounters. "Clara," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." She turned toward him in amazement. "Father." "I was wrong about the documents," Tom Bell continued. "Wrong about Mr. McGraw's character. Wrong about a lot of things. I let my pride and my anger cloud my judgment, and I nearly destroyed my relationship with my only daughter in the process." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "You don't have to apologize for fighting for what you believed was right." "Yes, I do," her father insisted, "because fighting for what's right shouldn't require abandoning what's good. You and Mr. McGraw, Silas, you found something precious together, something that honors both our families' histories. I was a fool to try to tear it apart." Silas stepped forward, extending his hand to Clara's father. "Mr. Bell, I hope we can start fresh. Your daughter means everything to me, and I'd be honored to have your blessing for our marriage." Tom Bell studied Silas's face for a long moment, then clasped his hand firmly. "You have it, son, and you have my apology for the trouble I've caused." Samuel Bell and Joseph McGraw would be proud to see their grandchildren united at last. As the three of them stood together in the courthouse hallway, Clara felt a sense of completion that went beyond the legal resolution of their dispute. Two families that had been torn apart by one man's greed were finally healing, finding their way back to the friendship and partnership their grandfathers had envisioned. "When will you be married?" Tom Bell asked. Clara and Silas exchanged glances. "As soon as possible," Clara replied. "We've waited long enough to start our life together." Her father smiled, the first genuine smile she'd heard from him in years. "Then let's go find a preacher. It's time to make this official." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Clara felt the weight of months of conflict finally lifting from her shoulders. The battle was over, justice had been served, and love had triumphed over division. Their grandfather's dream of uniting the Bell and McGraw families was about to become reality, not through business partnership, but through the deeper bond of marriage and mutual devotion. The sun was setting over the Wyoming landscape as they made their way to the church, painting the snow-covered plains in shades of gold and rose. It was, Clara thought, the perfect backdrop for the beginning of their new life, together beautiful, peaceful, and filled with infinite promise. The years that followed the courthouse reconciliation were the happiest of Clara's life, marked by the deep contentment that comes from a love freely chosen and fully embraced. She and Silas married 3 days after Judge Morrison's ruling, in a simple ceremony at the local church with her father, proudly walking her down the aisle, a gesture that healed wounds neither of them had fully acknowledged until that moment. Their partnership proved to be everything their grandfathers had envisioned and more. Clara's music program flourished, drawing students from throughout the territory, while Silas expanded his ranching operation with the wisdom that came from truly understanding the land's history. The eastern acres that now belonged to the Bell family were leased back to Silas for joint grazing, creating the unified operation that Samuel Bell and Joseph McGraw had dreamed of decades earlier. Tom Bell, perhaps seeking to make amends for the pain he'd caused, became a frequent visitor to the ranch, eventually moving into a small house on his portion of the property. He and Silas developed a relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to honoring their grandfather's memory. Clara often found the two men sitting on the front porch in the evenings, discussing cattle prices and weather patterns with the easy familiarity of old friends. The music room in the converted bunkhouse became the heart of a thriving cultural community. Clara taught not just children but adults who'd always harbored secret dreams of learning to play piano. She organized concerts and social evenings, bringing together families from across the region in celebrations that strengthened the bonds of frontier community. The old upright piano, restored to perfect condition, became known throughout the territory for the beautiful melodies that flowed from its keys. Silas, meanwhile, discovered that his wealth meant more when it was shared in service of something larger than personal comfort. He funded the construction of a proper schoolhouse and helped establish a lending library that served families for hundreds of miles around. His generosity was legendary, but it was the quiet acts of kindness that Clara treasured most the way. He always ensured that struggling families had meat for their tables, the way he mentored young men who needed guidance, the way he loved her with a constancy that never wavered through all the seasons of their life together. Their love deepened and matured through the years, becoming something richer and more complex than the passionate romance of their early days. They learned to communicate without words, to anticipate each other's needs, to find joy in the simple routines of shared life. Clara's blindness ceased to be a limitation and became instead a different way of experiencing the world, one that often revealed beauties and truths that escaped those who relied only on sight. They never had children of their own, but their ranch became home to dozens of young people over the years, orphans, students, apprentices, and strays who found in Clara and Silas the stability and love they'd been seeking. The house that had once echoed with loneliness became filled with laughter and music, and the comfortable chaos of an extended family bound together by choice rather than blood. As Clara aged, her hair turning silver and her hands developing the arthritis that eventually curtailed her playing, she found new ways to share her gift for music. She composed pieces that captured the rhythms and melodies of prairie life, creating a musical legacy that would be performed long after her death. Her students became teachers themselves, carrying her methods and philosophy to new communities throughout the growing state. Silas aged more slowly, his tall frame remaining strong, and his mind sharp well into his 70s. But Clara could sense the gradual changes in him, the way he moved a little more carefully, the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence, as if listening to something only he could hear. She suspected he was hearing the call of eternity, the gentle summons that comes to all souls when their earthly work is nearly complete. On a spring morning in their 43rd year of marriage, Clara woke to find Silas standing by their bedroom window, looking out at the ranch with the expression of a man taking inventory of a life well lived. "What do you see out there?" she asked, joining him at the window. "Everything we built together," he replied, slipping his arm around her waist. "The pastures where our cattle graze, the buildings where our friends gather, the roads that connect us to the larger world. But mostly I see the fulfillment of a promise, the promise that love can triumph over division, that two wounded hearts can heal each other." Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body, the strength that had sustained her through 4 decades of shared life. "Do you have any regrets?" "Only one," Silas said quietly. "I regret that we can't live it all again, exactly as it was, just for the joy of experiencing it twice." They died within 3 days of each other in the autumn of their 78th and 76th years, respectively. Silas went first, peacefully in his sleep, after a day spent riding the boundaries of the ranch one final time. Clara followed him 3 days later, as if her heart simply couldn't bear to beat without his nearby. Their funeral was the largest gathering in the territory's history, drawing people from as far away as Denver and Salt Lake City. The service was held outdoors on the hill overlooking the ranch, with music provided by 4 generations of Clara's students. As her final composition was performed, a piece called "The Song of Home" that captured all the love and longing and fulfillment of a life shared with purpose, there wasn't a dry eye among the hundreds of mourners. They were buried side by side in a small cemetery they'd established on the hill, their shared headstone bearing the simple inscription, "Silas and Clara McGraw united in love, eternal in memory." Below their names was carved a musical staff with the opening notes of "Beautiful Dreamer," the song that had first connected them to the memory of love transcending time. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of Tom Bell's grandson and his wife, who had grown up hearing stories of the legendary love between the blind piano teacher and the wealthy rancher. The music room was preserved exactly as Clara had left it, and visiting musicians often reported hearing faint melodies drifting through the building at twilight, as if her spirit still moved among the keys she had loved so well. Years passed, and the story of Silas and Clara McGraw became legend throughout the American West. Travelers would detour from their journeys just to see the ranch where two families' ancient friendship had been renewed through the marriage of their grandchildren. The old-timers who had witnessed their courtship would gather in saloons and general stores, sharing memories of the blind woman who could tame any horse with a gentle word, and the wealthy rancher who had learned to see the world through her extraordinary perception. Their love story was told and retold, growing richer with each telling, until it became the sort of tale that parents shared with their children as an example of how love could overcome any obstacle. It was a story about second chances and the healing power of forgiveness, about the courage required to choose love over fear, and about the beautiful symmetry that sometimes emerges when people have the wisdom to trust in something larger than their own understanding. The two weathered rocking chairs that still sat on the front porch of the ranch house became a pilgrimage site of sorts for couples facing their own challenges. Local folklore held that lovers who sat in those chairs together while watching the sunset would be blessed with the same enduring happiness that Silas and Clara had shared. Whether or not the folklore was true, the chairs were rarely empty during the golden hour when day surrendered to night across the Wyoming plains. On quiet evenings, when the wind moved through the cottonwood trees they had planted together, visitors sometimes claimed they could hear the echo of laughter, the gentle murmur of conversation, and the faint sound of piano music drifting across the grassland. These moments felt like benedictions, reminders that some loves are so deep and true that they leave permanent impressions on the places where they flourished. The legacy of Silas and Clara McGraw lived on not just in the stories told about them, but in the countless lives they had touched during their years together. Their students became teachers, their adopted children became community leaders, and their example of choosing love over division inspired generations of couples to fight for their relationships rather than surrender to the forces that might tear them apart. And somewhere in the high country of Wyoming, where the prairie grass still sings in the wind and the mountains stand eternal watch over the land, their love story continues a testament to the truth that some bonds are stronger than death, some promises last beyond time, and some dreams, when planted in faithful hearts, bloom forever in the soil of human memory. In the end, theirs was a love that fulfilled every promise love can make: to heal what is broken, to unite what is divided, to create beauty from sorrow, and to prove that even in a world marked by loss and disappointment, two souls can find their way to each other and build something worthy of eternity. It was the kind of love their grandfathers had dreamed of, the kind of love the prairie had been waiting to witness, and the kind of love that reminds us all why we continue to believe in the possibility of happily ever after.